Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch. I'm your host, Vikas Swarup. Tonight, we are going to focus on an international crisis that has grabbed global headlines. It is being described as the most dangerous East-West confrontation since the collapse of the Soviet Union and one deemed to be capable of triggering a new Cold War. I'm talking about the military conflict between the two largest countries in Europe, Russia and Ukraine, which has already killed more than 14,000 people and displaced over 1.4 million. On February 24, Russian President Putin announced a military operation in Ukraine. Ukraine's President Zelenskyy has introduced martial law across the country. The United States and several Western nations have imposed stringent new sanctions on Russia. It is clear that this conflict will have huge implications for European security, the United States, NATO, the European Union, the global economy, and of course, India. Now that the war in Ukraine has begun, how is it going to play out? And what are the stakes for Russia, Ukraine, the West, and of course, India? To discuss all these issues, I have with me two outstanding experts. Joining us from Hyderabad is Ambassador D.B. Venkatesh Varma, who till October last year was India's ambassador to Russia. An expert in the field of multilateral non-proliferation and disarmament, he has also served as India's ambassador to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva and to the Kingdom of Spain. And joining us from New Delhi is Dr. Ummu Salma Bava, Professor and Jean Monnet Chair at the Center for European Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University. She is an expert on European foreign and security policy and a recipient of the Federal Cross of Merit, Germany's highest civil honor. A very warm welcome to both of you. Let me begin with you, Ambassador Varma. President Putin claims that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, and his moves in Ukraine are merely rectifying a historical injustice. Which history is he referring to? Can you take us through the real origins of the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
The relations between Russia and Ukraine are, of course, go back more than 1,000 years. This is the same set of people coming from the same area between the White Sea and the Black Sea, and two big rivers, the Dnieper and the Volga. Kyievsky Rus was created about 1,000 years ago. It had a common cultural and religious space. Christianity came to both the Russian and Ukrainian people at the same time. But of course, Kyiv is a city that was established, which is the center of Kyievsky Rus. It lasted until about the 13th century. The Mongols invaded that area, and thereafter it is the Russian Empire from the north that invaded that larger area and incorporated the space between the Volga River and up to the space between the White Sea and the Black Sea under the Catherine the Great. During the Bolshevik period, for a brief time in 1917, Ukraine nationalists declared an independent republic, but this was taken over by the Bolsheviks when they created the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. And 1922, the Ukrainian Soviet Republic joined the Soviet Union as a constituent republic. Of course, this broke up in 1991. So there is some truth to the fact that Ukrainian and Russian people are very close. Their language is very close. There is a huge amount of intermarriage. The churches are very close. But the fact is that Ukraine has always had a separate national identity. And after the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine has been an independent sovereign state lasting for 30 years.
But what are the Russian arguments for taking military action against Ukraine?
Russia's argument has been that Russia had accepted Ukraine as an independent country after 1991, but Russia had great difficulties in Ukraine trying to seek external sponsors and patrons for its security. Russia has been dead against NATO joining NATO, NATO coming and incorporating Ukraine, because that would bring NATO right up to its doorstep. Western Ukraine has a very strong pro-European, pro-NATO, pro-American orientation. Eastern Ukraine is largely Russian, and they would like to retain their relationships with Russia. So the question of NATO membership has been largely divisive within Ukraine. And of course, this has come to a head because both NATO and the United States said that they will not close the door for NATO membership for Ukraine. So that has led to a creation of a division within Ukraine. And the intense incentive to compromise with Russia is also decreased because the Minsk agreement was created in 2015. Russia has said that both the United States and the hardliners in Ukraine did not want the implementation of the Minsk agreement. The Minsk agreement would have allowed the two eastern regions to have stayed within a united Ukraine, but with local autonomy. That didn't work out. And of course, the more proximate reason that President Putin has given is the presence of extreme right-wing and neo-Nazi groups within Ukraine that have created enmity between Ukraine and Russia.
That was a good overview of the Russian argument over Ukraine. But there are always two sides to every story. So what is the Ukrainian perspective in all this?
The Ukrainian perspective is that Ukraine is an independent country. They would like to have a choice on who their external partners are, which in a sense, in a theoretical sense, is there is certain validity to it. Ukraine nationalists are also very keen that they will not come under Russian domination. That is a very understandable instinct, a very understandable sentiment. But the fact is that there is no single sentiment within Ukraine. In 2014, the new government that came about after the overthrow of the previous democratically elected government, Russia sees it as a coup d'etat. Ukraine sees it as the democratization of Ukraine. So there are, of course, always two sides of the story. Ukraine is entitled to its sovereignty and territorial integrity and independence, but it is also this theoretical right, this legal right has to be protected by its own actions in terms of carrying forward policies that would reinforce territorial integrity and sovereignty rather than increase the threats.
Turning to you, Professor Bava, many experts are calling this the biggest stress test of the European security architecture since the Second World War. As an expert on European security, how do you read the situation and its ramifications for European geopolitics?
Let me make 4 observations on the present situation. Point 1 is clearly the post-Cold War order has collapsed. And even as negotiations were going on to avoid a full-fledged conflict, we can see that the opposite has happened. And ironically, 3 decades after the Soviet Union imploded in 1991, Moscow is seeking to rewrite the rules of engagement in Europe, first with the use of force, and it is also a violation of international law. And both of it have, major global ramifications. Second, one could also say that the coercive power of Russia has grown, and the European security architecture has started, unraveled, doing 2 things. One, it has exposed the strategic vulnerability of the Baltic states, that is Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and the frontline countries, Poland and Hungary. Now, while the EU is able to use diplomatic and economic instruments, the territorial defense of Europe, especially the frontline state, will now rest totally with NATO and a transatlantic leadership. Third, today's conflict, what we are seeing playing out, is embedded in the past. In a recent op-ed in the NYT, Thomas Friedman said that in 1998, as the US Senate adopted a NATO expansion, he spoke to George Kennan, the author of the US containment policy. And Kennan had observed that this is the start of a new Cold War. I think what we see today is that script is playing out as Putin decides how he's going to salami slice Ukraine and rearrange the chessboard of European security. If one looks at the EU as a security actor in all of this, the EU cannot put up any kind of military defense for Ukraine. And hard power military deployment is only possible by NATO, which has already started. So this also shows how much Europe is dependent on Washington and the alliance for a real territorial defense. More recently, Belarus has also confirmed that Russian troops will remain indefinitely in the country, signaling that what we are going to witness and what we have witnessed in the last, 3 days is the escalation. And that is the name of the new game. Ukraine declared emergency, and this has been followed by, the war starting out. And while Nancy Pelosi, had called it an attack on democracy, what you're seeing is that now, who will walk the talk in terms of protecting what will be called as European security is going to really play itself out.
Now, Germany has said that it is halting certification of the Nordic Stream 2 gas pipeline following Moscow's actions in eastern Ukraine. The 750-mile pipeline was completed in September but has not yet received final certification from German regulators. Without that, natural gas cannot flow through the Baltic Sea pipeline from Russia to Germany. So how do you assess the economic impact of what's happening in Ukraine now on Europe in general and Germany in particular, which gets a whopping 55% of its gas imports from Russia?
So you're right. I think the entire region, Ukraine included, is going to face economic consequences. For Ukraine in particular, let's begin there, is going to be crippling on the Ukrainian economy. The currency has already started falling. Now that war has started, you will see the entire economy being made subservient to war, which means, loss of revenue, closing of airspace, withdrawal of investment. So that's long term. On the closure of the Nord Stream 2, this was a major point and a point of contention between the US and Germany as well. And then Scholz came through on it that, yes, it would be not allowed. And this will majorly impact Russia in cutting its revenue, but will also throw a seizure into the European economies, yes, as Russia will also decide to cut back further on gas, thereby reducing the maneuvering space for the Europeans. This will also result in very high energy costs in Europe. We have to keep in mind it's still the middle of winter over there. And it's going to have two things. It will push up inflation further. It will also cut down on the domestic purchasing power, impacting the European economic recovery. Now, there is also the issue about the kind of sanctions which will now be escalated given the outbreak of war. We will see, action on pushing Russia out of the SWIFT. Many economists are also predicting that this will also create major disruptions for international transaction, and it can lead to currency volatility. In the case of Germany, as you've correctly pointed out, given the high dependence of 55% on gas coming from Russia, this is also a legacy of the 1970 Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt. So it's going to hurt Germany the most, and there will be an immediate attempt to offset some of it with America coming in and trying to, at least at the European level, to get some more supplies from Norway. But overall, what it means is Europe is looking at a very hard winter, and Germany in particular will also see the impact on its trade.
And what would you say would be the impact of this conflict on the global economy?
I think global economic recovery is going to be impacted further. The first thing we will see today would be the
just when we were trying to come out of the pandemic.
The sanctions are going to create conditions which is not conducive to economic growth and recovery post the pandemic. And this will have implications not only for Europe, but the US and globally. These sanctions which will be hit on Russia will also be disrupting trade and financial services for everybody. So I think in the short term, what you would see is an economic tsunami which could hit global markets, which can push back the nascent economic recovery. One should be also prepared for volatile stock markets and loss of market value. And it will also have implications further for us. For example, for India, we will be also looking at rising fuel costs.
Now, one country that will be closely watching the unfolding developments in Ukraine is China. In fact, some analysts have gone so far as to say that how the West responds to Russia's military actions in Ukraine could set the template for China to undertake a similar action vis-à-vis Taiwan. How will the rupture between Russia and the West impact Beijing?
Well, in a sense, global regional instability in Europe is always a welcome diversion for China, because especially all the European countries and Russia and the United States will have less attention for the Indo-Pacific region. But there is a fundamental difference between Ukraine and Taiwan. Ukraine doesn't have a security cover under NATO because Ukraine was not a member of NATO. Therefore, the United States does not have a legal treaty obligation to defend Ukraine, and President Biden has very clearly said that he does not envisage sending troops to Ukraine to defend Ukraine. However, there is a security treaty uh, between the United States and Taiwan, and the United States is committed to come to the defense of Taiwan if China were to take action to forcibly integrate Taiwan into China. The United States supports a one China policy, but the United States has been very clear that if this one China policy is enforced through the use of military force, then the United States will come to the defense of Taiwan. Recently, Japan also changed its defense policy somewhat in a very significant way, that it stated very clearly that as part of this larger security architecture in the Indo-Pacific, Japan would see an attack on Taiwan as an attack on Japan, and would therefore, the implication being that Japan might come to the aid of Taiwan. Taiwan, in a sense, is not exactly comparable to Ukraine. Taiwan is a democracy. They have a very good democratic system and extremely successful economy. In semiconductors, they are world leaders, so to speak. They have been very careful on not provoking China. If the provocation has come, it has only come from China and not from Taiwan.
Well, certainly, I think we will see a closer alignment between Russia and China after what's happening in Ukraine. Now, Professor Bava, India has so far adopted a very cautious stance on this matter. What are the stakes for India in this conflict?
So, as you correctly said, India has taken a very cautious stance. But I think as the conflict and standoff has escalated, the stakes for India have only been rising. India abstained in the last voting in the UNSC in January, clearly buying time and not wanting to take sides between Moscow and Washington. But I think the room for maneuver has been shrinking very fast. I see personally there are three main aspects over here. One is the military factor. I think with half the weapons procurement and service points and the new joint productions that India has with Russia, it's not easy for New Delhi to issue an ultimatum to Moscow. I think at the same time, taking sides with Moscow also could lead to American sanctions through the CAATSA. So it's going to be weighted in on that first ground. Second, is the China factor. Now, India would needs the weight, I would say, of both Washington and Moscow to offset China in the region. And both US and Russia bring their own strengths to the equation. Now, while America can, as Ambassador Varma pointed out, can also checkmate China and deter China, Russia's closeness to Beijing can also bring to India certain kind of dividends when it is required. So again, we find there's a tightrope walking for India happening. And a third important factor, I would say, would be the economic. War will, impact fuel prices. It's going to disrupt supply chains. One of the items of concerns for India in the immediate will be cooking oil supplies. It will come as a surprise to many that in terms of trade, 70% of India's import of sunflower oil comes from Ukraine. And,
yes.
That will mean that we see disruption and a hike in domestic prices and consumption in the country. It is also going to impact the stock market. The stock exchange has just opened, investment plans, and overall health of the economy. So we're looking at these three intertwined factors. And then immediately now what we're confronted with is a large number of students who are there in Ukraine and a business community.
About 18,000 students, I believe.
Evacuated very soon before it becomes a much larger humanitarian issue. I just want to draw attention to the fact that in 2014, the then National Security Advisor had also said that, Russia had legitimate interests were involved. Now, I think that point has already started playing out in our region since 2020. The challenge here is that, legitimizing territorial aggression in another part of the world or not, coming out more distinctly on that can also be costly for India. So India will have to move with utmost caution, not to create a bad precedence under law and to balance the equation with both the strategic partners.
Ambassador Varma, as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, is India handling the situation in the right way?
No, I think India has taken a very well-considered and a very balanced position. Uh, uh, we heard the statements at the UN Security Council. There have been 3 meetings, including one late last night and early this morning, where India has taken a very precise and balanced position. The position has also evolved along with the evolving situation. The main components of this are the following: that we supported the use of diplomatic pathways for settling the crisis. When it was relevant and still alive, we gave full support to the Minsk Agreement. And the Minsk Agreement was supported by Russia, by the United States, by the European Union. It was not implemented by Ukraine. That is the allegation that has come out. We supported the Normandy process, which gave a certain role to both France and Germany to take care of a major European security crisis in Central Europe. Well, that didn't play out. With the commencement of more overt conflict this morning, India has in fact gone ahead and expressed concern and regret of the change in developments. As has been mentioned, India has been very clear that there are legitimate security interests of all sides. This includes the legitimate security interests of Russia, which is to have a periphery which is stable, which is not anti-Russian. That is a legitimate expectation of any major power. And I would say that we have to understand the reasons why Russia came to this. And India has also been saying that these events have to be understood in the sequence of events that have taken place over a three-decade period. Secondly, we have also said legitimate security interests of Ukraine. We have not ignored that. In fact, we have supported the measures that would embed Ukraine in a larger European architecture. Now, it is also a failure of European diplomacy that these last 30 years have not been used to create an European architecture that would accommodate Russia. We are at this point where European architecture of security is isolated. It is crumbling in front of our eyes, largely on account of the fact that Russia feels that it is not been given its due place in Europe. And how can you have European security without Russia? It is a misnomer. But the fact is, Russia tried for over 30 years to find a place. And it is, in fact, a failure at several levels. A level of Russian policy, as I have mentioned, a failure of European, Ukrainian diplomacy, but it is also a failure of European security policy. What have they brought upon themselves is a question that they need to ponder. So I would say that India has taken a very well-considered position. We should be careful in not being pulled in any direction. Protection of our core interests should be the only criteria for determining our foreign policy position on this. We support diplomacy, we support the restoration of peace, we also support legitimate security interests. But if any country were to use this as an excuse to put pressure on India, we should draw the line very clearly and tell them we are answerable only to ourselves. If there are pressures to create difficulties for our arms supplies, we should be very firm on that point. If there are pressures to create difficulties for our energy security, we should be very firm on that point.
Final question to both my panelists. How do you see this conflict playing out? Can it be contained at an early date? Dr. Bava, you want to go first?
Thank you so much. So I think, the war has started, and what we saw, a precursor to the troops moving, was the beginning of hybrid warfare. So I think all of us would need to update our lexicon first now. We are clearly going to see new patterns of engagement. I think along with sanctions and other measures coming into place, there will be an attempt to contain it. I think allowing a spiraling of it would have major repercussions for all actors involved, not only in Europe, but for America and globally. So I think the intention of Moscow may also be to send out a strong message. It will hold ground up to a certain extent in probably the Donbass region. the line of contact and stop it at that point. It now depends on how the other members on the chessboard would like to respond and move to it. I think, as Ambassador Varma has very correctly pointed out, the door to diplomacy should never be closed and cannot be closed. So even as war is taking place on the ground, I think all efforts will be made to contain it, to roll back to a point where it can still be managed and then get into a post-crisis management.
Ambassador Varma?
Yes, I would agree with my fellow panelist, Professor Bava. The door to diplomacy should never be closed. The situation on the ground is still evolving. We hope that this is a limited military conflict, limited in area, limited in scope, and limited in intensity. We do not wish to be part of a conflict situation where the costs for India, in a sense, rise. India should extend its hand for any diplomatic efforts that would resolve the crisis. We are placed uniquely at the United Nations Security Council at this point of time. We have excellent relations with Russia, which are long-standing. They should be preserved and protected, but our dialogue with Russia should be taken forward. We have very good relations with Ukraine, as with all ex-Soviet republics. We wish to see that the life and interests of the well-being of the Indian nationals in Ukraine and in the conflict zone is protected. That is, in fact, the priority for us at the present moment. But there are larger issues of how the financial blowback of sanctions, the energy implications, the implications on our economy due to the rising oil prices, due to the impact on the price of credit in the international markets, the markets that will be dislocated because of the ongoing conflict. These are huge and, in a sense, deeply worrying trends. So it is in our interest that we extend a hand to all the partners, and India has excellent relations across the board. India's voice is heard, India's voice is respected. And I think without necessarily creating a public show of deepening conflict, I think we should contribute behind the scenes to lessening conflict, which will be not only in the regional and international interests, but also in our own interests.
I would like to thank both my panelists for their valuable insights, which have enlarged our understanding of what the stakes are for Russia, the West, and Ukraine in this conflict. It is also clear that escalation will set us down a path from which it will be impossible to return, and the entire world will have to face its catastrophic consequences. So we can only hope, as our panelists have said, that all sides will step back from the brink and diplomacy will find a solution, as it has on numerous occasions in the past. That is all I have for you on this edition of Diplomatic Dispatch. Till we meet again next week, good evening and goodbye.